Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Doug Melville, the author of Invisible Generals, Rediscovering Family Legacy, and a Quest to Honor America's First Black Generals. He is the global head of diversity for a luxury holding company, and this is his first book. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Melville.
Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. From birth until one is old enough to ask questions, there is no backstory. Nothing existed before you, and the forces that made you are unknown. You came from mommy's tummy, the story goes. Doug Melville writes that we are the recipients of our ancestors' journeys, and that those journeys impact where we're raised, what schools we go to, what we do for a living. An experience at a movie theater, though, a movie screening, led Doug on a journey, a movie that should have featured his ancestors. Instead, the very famous filmmaker's examination of the Tuskegee Airmen was fictional and omitted the names of the airmen themselves. One name that should have been included is Benjamin O. Davis. Doug, what did the omission of Benjamin O. Davis suggest about the way history picks and chooses its heroes?
Well, I think the first thing that you can realize is that Hollywood's job may not be to tell history accurately, but in the United States of America, many people look at Hollywood movies as history, and that's the reality of the situation. And we can recite different movies we've seen that were all very realistic with realistic characters. But when the movie Red Tails came out, I was invited to a screening in 2011. The movie came out in the beginning of 2012. So I invited to a screening, and it's many of the living Tuskegee Airmen. It's also many of the actors in the movie. And when the movie starts, Terrence Howard is one of the main characters, and he is the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. He is the commander of the Red Tails. And in real life, this is General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He looks like him. He stands like him. He talks like him. And then when he's addressed on the screen, they say Colonel Bullard, not Colonel Davis. And I look around in the theater saying, is anybody else tracking? And no
it's not
one,
funny, but yeah.
Everyone's in the movie, and I'm looking around trying to understand what is going on. And the movie ends. And we have a party afterward. And I start asking around, who changed the names? What happened with the names? And no matter who I asked, they would say, oh, Doug, it's an amalgamation.
They're there.
Hollywood. This isn't a documentary.
And one of the people who said this to you is maybe the most famous person in, I don't want to say the world, but pretty darn close.
Yeah, Oprah Winfrey. She was the first person that I had met at the party, because they had arranged a meeting with her and I as part of, the general's family, to meet her personally and talk to her. And she was so interested in my opinion of the movie. And she said, Doug, what did you think of the movie? And all I was just looking at her kind of in space and time, saying, who changed the names? And then she said, well, Doug, this is Hollywood. This is a movie, Doug. And what she's saying is right. But at that moment, I just couldn't believe that there was a party, an event where the actual real people were there and they weren't on the screen, and I look at these men, when I see them, Evan, and they have nurses and breathing machines and oxygen tanks. And they went to the screening to see themselves and the names were changed.
Did was obviously this is painful partially because this is an ancestor of yours and someone you'd
Mm-hmm.
heard about,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm just curious, did the fact that these are black leaders, given the history of what's gone on in America with race, did the fact that they were black make that a particularly painful thing that their names were omitted?
Well, let me say this. So Benjamin O. Davis was the patriarch and center of our family. He raised my dad. He paid for my college, my first car, a Honda Accord. He was the main man in our whole family. So when he was omitted from the film, it just personally hit me. But then when I went home and I talked to my dad, he says to me, "But Doug, we're black. Of course they changed the names." And I didn't even ever in my life, and I'm telling you the God honest truth, I never looked at it like that. I never said, oh, this happened only because of race. I never looked at it like that. But my dad, through lived experience, said, if you think removing the names is a big deal, let me tell you the real story of the family, and shared with him and shared with me the story of the Invisible Generals. And he told me the story of how Ben Davis Jr. raised him from the time he was 7 and brought him up, and he lived in Tuskegee. And my dad tells me this incredible story. And I'm so mesmerized by it that it makes me want to stop my career and find out what actually happened. And
Yeah,
that
and
was
so
the impetus for me to write the book.
yeah, and so I want to ask about that. I mean, here you are, you've got clearly a successful career. You're working in corporate, I guess, global corporations at this point, and you, as you put it, stopped your career. You say, I've got to write a book, and that force on you is put up against this thing that your dad told you, which struck me from the book, which is, he said, we don't talk too much and we don't correct people.
Mm-hmm.
How did those two things collide in your decision to go after this book?
Well, it was a little bit, it wasn't really well received in the beginning because my dad thought talking about race, bringing up the past and trying to make noise about it would never get me anywhere professionally. He really thought, he had paid, for school. Ben had, brought us all this way. And why would I want to ruin it by trying to go back and talk about race? So he really wasn't for me going deeper into this because he just felt nothing good can come out of it. It'll take up my time, it'll take up my resources, and then ultimately nothing good will come out of it. So he really wanted me to focus on my career and have a family and stop worrying about what happened yesterday, because he didn't tell me, because he didn't want me to think about it. It was almost like a way of a parent shielding a child from the past.
What would Ben Jr. and Senior have said about your pursuit?
I think they would be so surprised that someone was this interested in it, because they were so humble and they were so everyday. I don't know if you could be a 4-star general and be blue collar, but these guys were the most salt of the earth. No medals around the house, no pictures of military, feng shui. You would never know that they even did what they did in this life. All you would know is that they're sweet, older people. And I think it would have been a pleasant surprise for them. I don't think they would have believed it, to be honest with you.
Before you went on this journey, what did you know about your family's backstory? What descriptions of their journey had made it to you?
So Ben Davis Jr., from the time I was born, we were every holiday, every Thanksgiving, we would always spend time together. They lived in Arlington. Our family was in Connecticut. We would drive down weekends, the whole thing with the family. It wasn't until literally 1998 when we were invited to the White House. I was
I love
21.
this story, by the way, but go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
I was 21 years old. And our family is invited to the White House under the Clinton administration to elevate Ben to 4-star status. So he had had 3 stars in combat. In 1967, under LBJ, it was discussed with him that he was going to get a 4th star. LBJ ultimately told him that he put Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court. He passed Martin Luther King's civil rights agenda, and there was no more political advantages by doing anything else towards someone who was Black. So promoting Ben to 4-star general was not going to happen. He retires in 1970, and then let's cut all the way to 1998. John McCain is on a decade-long mission to get Benjamin O. Davis Jr. his 4th star. And it's written into the Defense Act of 1998 that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. will get elevated and promoted to 4-star general, under the condition that the family does not receive any financial compensation for the 30 plus years that he did not have the 4th star, which was almost $1 million.
Wow.
His wife of 62 years does not go. Evan, she does not go to the ceremony. 62 years married. And she gets in an argument with the family. Why are you going? We all that they've done with us, all that they've done to the family, the least they could do is, if you're going to acknowledge we should have gotten the 4th star, all you have to do is compensate us for the money. And that was part of the deal.
As you watched this ceremony, were you able to find pride in it, or was there this black cloud over it given the preconditions?
It never sat well with me. And if the question was, what did I know about the story and when did I know it? This particular incident was definitely a spark. Although the flame didn't ignite till later, this was very disturbing.
Wow.
Because I didn't know about politics. I don't know about all these things, military honors in the past. You just don't really know necessarily how that works. It so rarely happens that it's not like it's something that's planned. So when they say no money, but the honor will be pinned on your lapel, but you won't get money going backwards or forward. So you don't get the back money or any accrued money. And he passed away in 2002, and 1967 to 2002 is 35 years of retirement.
Unbelievable. What do we need to know before we get further into the story itself? What do we need to know about the Tuskegee Airmen to understand the magnitude of who your ancestors were? Just give us as much of history as you can. I realize you're not a trained historian, but what do we need to know? What are the basics of this amazing group who absolutely have a storied place in our history, or at least they should?
Yeah, the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of 15,000 men and women during World War II who operated on behalf of the United States in a 100% segregated Air Force. So the commander of that Air Force was Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He had never commanded a group before. He was a West Point graduate. And the assignment was, can you manage and maintain a segregated Air Force during World War II? They trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. They were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen term includes the 1,000 pilots, but also includes the 14,000 ground staff, food staff. And the thing that's the most important thing to know about this, the military at this time in World War II was 100% segregated. If a part of an airplane was on a white pilot's plane, they would not allow that part to be used on a black pilot's plane. If there was a wrench used on a white pilot's plane, it was not allowed to be used as a black pilot's plane. And this is during the middle of World War II. I mean, even thinking
Well, you need
about
all
it.
the help you can get, right?
Yeah. So the Tuskegee Airmen were that group of men. Now, I share the importance of the invisible generals is because without them, there would not have been a Tuskegee Airmen group, because FDR was looking to get reelected, and he wanted to ensure that he could maintain and capture the black vote. So he elevates Benjamin O. Davis Sr. as the advisor to Negro policy for troops in the United States of America. And he asks him, what do I need to do to win the black vote in the next election? And Ben Davis Sr. said, you must show that the United States military, which at the time would have been the largest company in the United States of America, that they give equal pay and equal opportunities to blacks. At that time, all the blacks were doing what was called pick and shovel jobs, which were building the railroads, digging the ditches. 100% of the kitchen staff in the United States was black. 100% of certain jobs were all black Americans. And he said, you must allow blacks an equal opportunity. And that starts with allowing them to fly. And then FDR said, who would lead it? And he said, my son. And that is when Ben Davis Jr. went down to Tuskegee, Alabama, graduated with a handful of other pilots. But because he was a West Point grad, he ended up commanding the Tuskegee Airmen. So you can understand when the name is removed from the movie for me, I'm just saying you can't have the movie without this story. I mean, you can say whatever you want about it, but the movie needs this story in particular.
And the story doesn't need enhancement, by the way, to be interesting. I mean, you sat here and told it to me in 2.5, 3 minutes, and I'm transfixed. What were they thinking?
The story is better than, I mean, you're right. It's just.
Before we pick up the narrative again, how did you get into the writing process? What kind of training did you have to put together a book that would be purchased by a Big Five publisher?
The main challenge was taking a 150-year time period and narrowing it down into something that was digestible, because we were going through 5 generations. So the military was the through line, and then also how many different presidential administrations they worked for. So we were, looking at it linearly, laying out the story. And when I say we, my best friend helped me with research and history and everything, because there was so much research and history that had to be done in so many sources.
So what were the
it was like,
yeah, what were the sources? What, this is a family story. So how are you marrying what you could get from your family with what the public archives were and building a cohesive story?
And that was exactly it. So Ben Davis Jr. and Sr. both independently had books that they both published. So the first thing was understanding everything in both of their books was very important. Then we went to the historians at West Point, the historians at the Air Force Academy, the Army historian and the Air Force historian. Then you go to the family. My dad was the number one source because he lived with them from the time he was 7. So he knew, every base, all the planes, he knew, I mean, of course, he's there. It's his childhood.
Right.
So he was key to the whole story, really. And he was the key to unlock, because he hadn't really spoken in the past. So that was very, very important. The next thing
Did you do like oral history with him? I mean, did you just sit down and interview him time and again?
Hours.
Yeah.
We interviewed for hours with each other. And then, certain gentlemen from the Air Force, the Tuskegee Airmen, General Leon Johnson, he was the former president of the Tuskegee Airmen. I talked to the, General C.Q. Brown. He's the chief of staff of the United States of America. Most people know the story of Benjamin Davis who are in the Air Force, who are black pilots. So there's no real learning curve. They really are very familiar with the story. So you can get stories or recommendations on who to speak to. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, the Army War College, presidential libraries. So some of the things you have to look at, Evan, are tagging. So sometimes you would look at a photo and it would say President Ford and others.
Mm.
And then it wouldn't say their name. So what you kind of see when you talk about the term invisible generals is there's many stories out here. But when they're tagged, if the name is not on there, they don't show up when people search for it. And I think if you had to pinpoint a missing part of history, this is a very big, important part.
Completely fascinating. So, how did your dad, Judge L. Scott Melville, wind up being raised? Because we haven't even explained yet how you're related. So, explain how Judge L. Scott Melville was raised by Ben Davis Jr. and Ben Davis Jr.'s wife, Agatha.
So Ben Davis Jr. and his wife couldn't have any biological children, and it's something that I talk about in the book. But Ben Davis Jr. and his dad were so close, and it was such a father-son bond that Ben always wanted to have a son for himself. When his wife was unable to bear children, my dad was his oldest nephew and was 7 years old, living in Connecticut. And when Ben went down to Tuskegee, he was out flying, training, etc. Ben and his wife, Agatha, moved my dad down there and raised him from the time he was 7 all the way through college as his own son. He kept the name Melville, which is why my last name is Melville. And I think, honestly, Evan, that made the story even sweeter for me, because if you talk to Tuskegee Airmen, they will tell you that Ben Davis Jr. was like a father figure. He was the disciplinarian of, if it wasn't for him, they will all tell you could watch YouTube video. There wouldn't have been a Tuskegee Airman, because he had to be a pilot, a politician, a negotiator. I mean, the Army was segregated. He didn't have, it was all him. There was one voice, and he was scared to lead all the missions, because he said, if I get shot down, this whole program can get shot down. So he didn't want to fly all the missions. So I can only imagine how his mind worked. But in the middle of all that, him and his wife still wanted to maintain a family, and he still wanted that father-son bond. And my dad, fit the bill. And that was the story of how our family began.
Amazing. Who was the earliest ancestor that you could pin down? You said 150 years of a story. So from what I could tell, it was a guy named Lewis P.H. Davis. Explain how you were able to pin this person down, and who were they? What did you find out about him?
So this guy, Lewis P.H. Davis, he was Ben Davis Jr.'s grandfather. So he lived in the late 1800s, and he actually was a servant for a senator named Senator Logan. And Senator Logan picked him up as a young boy, moved him in his home, raised him as a servant, and everyone loved him as he got older. He became part of the fabric of the family, and he ended up on Ulysses S. Grant's presidential parade for his second inauguration. He's in the buggy. Lewis Davis is in the buggy with President U.S. Grant, with Grant's oldest son on his knee.
I thought that was crazy. I mean, I read that. I was like, what? You guys
crazy.
Are everywhere.
I mean, this is crazy. But, the reason I tell that part of the story is it's so important to understand we are the receipts of our ancestors' journey. If he doesn't have this allyship from General Logan to get in the mix of the relationships and the politics of DC, then he doesn't get the signature for his son to get into West Point. And now when Ben Davis Sr. tried to get into West Point, President McKinley did not sign him in, because they didn't want to get into the habit of allowing blacks into West Point. So Ben Davis Sr. runs away. He's so upset. And then he goes to Wyoming and joins the Buffalo Soldiers. And he meets Charles Young. He was a black graduate of West Point. And Charles Young says, you can get through West Point, but you'd have to train your son or someone from the time they were young in order for them to mentally get through all the conditions that someone would have to go to. So Ben Sr. realizes that Charles Young is actually giving him the blueprint for success. He takes that information. He becomes a great equestrian. And in 1901, President McKinley, who had rejected his application 2 years prior, elevates him to second lieutenant, which is the same rank you would get if you graduate from West Point, 2 years after going to Wyoming as an enlisted man, and then said, I saved you 2 years. And that was because Lewis P.H. Davis's influence with General Logan, Ulysses S. Grant. And then shortly after that, McKinley dies in office.
I was just going to say 1901, there couldn't have had, that must have been one of the last things he ever did.
Yes, he died soon thereafter. And then from 1901, Evan, 1901, Ben Davis Sr., wife dies in childbirth. He's a single dad with 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He takes his son flying because his son is stressed out. He lost his mother. And his son comes down and goes, Daddy, I want to be a pilot. And he says, the only way to do that is if we get you through West Point. And that is how Ben Davis Jr. got into West Point. His dad was the officer's signature to get him in. And in 1936, upon Ben Jr.'s graduation, when his father and him shook hands, they were the only 2 black officers in the military until World War II. So from 1901, the next black officer was 1936. And then from 1936 to the start of World War II, there was only 2 black officers. So their story is just so incredible. It was just hard for me to believe that no one heard of it. And it was just as hard for me to believe, like you said previously, a movie would leave it out when it is better than the whole movie, or at least as good as, or at least a prequel to.
It's like, okay. This question is just occurring to me now, and forgive me if it's inelegant or not worded sensitively enough. But the question that I want to ask is, how do you explain the determination of Black Americans to continue to serve this country, not only in war, but as in every type of public office that there is? How do you explain the fact that they kept on coming back, even though there was obstacle after obstacle after obstacle?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
You know, Ben Jr. would always say to me, the burden of some Americans is greater than others. He never looked at it negatively. He always looked at it positively. And I think if many Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, and I don't want to look at Black Americans as a monolithic group,
Right.
but many Black Americans looked at America as a nation that was sick or misguided and just needed medicine. They didn't look at it as if it was negative and it was, woe was me. They just looked at it and said, the patient is sick, and through performance, we can overcome the biases and stereotypes that have been levied upon us upon being born. And I just think that attitude and perspective was almost not acquired, but almost you're born with it. It's almost a superpower in some sense, but that was the attitude, and that was really the perspective of so many Black Americans.
Explain the impact of the Davises on President Truman finally desegregating the military, which, by the way, is now 75 years ago.
Yeah, and I actually just went to the Truman Library celebration in Washington, D.C., but 75 years ago, the United States Military Executive Order 9981, and I believe it was 9983. 9981 was equal for all races, but I think it was 9983 was equal for all genders. We actually don't normally talk about that one, but the one that allowed women equal opportunity was also at the time hailed as a quite large accomplishment, although it doesn't get the fanfare today as integration. But speaking of the Davises, when President Truman looked to integrate the military, it was through the data, through the performance of Ben Davis Jr. and Sr. that they looked at. Ben Davis Sr. had been in the military 50 years. The only Black general in the military, 50 years of service. No one had done it longer. He knew every rivet in the ship. He knew every story in the hopper. And then you have his son, the West Point grad, commanded 15,000 men, came back successful from World War II. The performance, the input, the insight, the collective man and brain power to create and draft these executive order was based on the information that Ben Davis Sr. and Ben Davis Jr. provided. So the assumption was Ben Davis Sr. and President Truman would both unveil the desegregation bill. And 6 days before the bill was announced, Benjamin Davis Sr. was told he was going to be asked to retire by President Truman, and his name was removed from the document.
How do you take that? I mean, I guess I can guess how you take it, but Truman has his legacy has really grown in stature over the last 75 years. How do you square that with that fact?
Well, I talk to people from the Truman Library, and I just say I have a disagreement with the narrative. I just, however you want to market it and position it is fine. I understand Truman's a president. You could go on YouTube and you could watch videos of Truman dropping, language that we all know what it is. So you could just go right on there. So it's not as if he's a saint by any means. He grew up in segregation. But my whole thing is go where you're celebrated, not tolerated, but go where you're compensated. And Ben Davis Sr. and Jr. were never celebrated. They were always tolerated. And at the end, they were never compensated. So for me, getting this story out into the universe is so important, because we must have a true full prism of history and allow the perspectives of the families of those who were there to live as well in the universe as the story that the history books have written.
Now, I just want to make clear here, their mark on history is massive. I read that Ben Jr. drew the line between China and Taiwan. I mean, every time you see that conflict, that has got to hit you in a certain way, that, my goodness, my family did that.
I mean, the thing about the line, there's something called the Taiwan Strait that separates Taiwan and China, and it's a nautical, invisible, understood and respected line in the water that separates each of the sides and their activity at sea. And that line was drawn by Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He flew his plane over. He looked at the dimensions of the space between the two areas. He drafted the line. He brought it back to the United States. It went to the UN, and that became the Davis Line. Now, when you go to Taiwan, they refer to it as the Davis Line. This is actually something that if you Googled it in newspapers and that side of the world, it's referred to as the Davis Line. In America, they don't call it that. They just call it,
The line,
the Aquatic line that separates Taiwan and China. So,
I have to say, I mean, I've released 140 episodes of this show. I guess I've got 2 or 3 waiting in the hopper, including this one. This is one of the most remarkable interviews that we have done on this show, and I'm very thankful you agreed to do this with us. What is it like for you with all that history and all of the things that we have talked about and all of the slights, some political in nature, some personal in nature, but all of them equally difficult to take? What is it like for you to go to Arlington and see them buried there?
well, Ben Davis Jr. died on the 4th of July, 2002. So the poetic justice of it is that after he's elevated to the 4th star in 1998, he lives 4 more years, and on the 4th of July passes away at Walter Reed Medical Center in the Eisenhower Room, where they wield generals and presidents. And he gets buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And when we go back to see the headstone is black. And we did not know as the family that the headstone was going to be black. But what we found out is that Ben requested a black tombstone so he could overlook those in death that overlooked him in life. And that Arlington no longer allows them. So there's just a handful of black tombstones. Thurgood Marshall was the first. I think there's one other one. And when you go see that at Arlington, I got to tell you, Evan, it is powerful to see that black tombstone with 4 stars on it overlooking all those fields of white tombstones. Because, Arlington was segregated until Executive Order 9981. I don't know if many people realize that.
I didn't know that. But yeah, maybe I've read it, but I forgot.
Arlington was segregated until it was allowed to be integrated with the 1947 Integration Act.
You have my word. I don't know when it's going to be. I've been to Arlington many times. You have my word and it's a big place, so I'm going to at least look up and see where it is, and if I can get there, I'm going to get there to the site itself. I promise. You have my word.
Hey, Evan, both invisible generals are buried on the same little hill, and they're walking distance from the entrance. You don't even got to take a trolley. You just walk. Right. It's just 2 little areas up, so it's pretty easy to get to.
I'm gonna go. This might be too personal, but did you ever confront this famous filmmaker directly about any of this?
No. It's funny because I am so happy that Red Tails was made, because it sparked 2 things. The world knew the story, which they never really knew at scale, and that would never happen if it wasn't for George Lucas and the whole family that created the film. And number 2, for me, if it wasn't for this movie and these names being changed, I can tell you, I don't know if I ever would have looked into this. Sometimes you need a piece of an emotion to take an action. Sometimes you need to feel anger or joy or something to go create motion and take an action. And for me personally, this happened to be it. So I'm appreciative of the movie. I'm glad the movie was made. And I think my story and the story of the Invisible Generals is just another angle and a continuation of the story. I mean, to me, they're the prequel and the sequel. You know, they're just a different story than the Tuskegee Airmen, although that is a big part of their story. Their story actually, to me, transcends a larger period and is more impactful on American history, but it all works together as one. So I'm not here to divide it. I'm just saying that everything helps everything.
Every family thinks their family story is the most interesting, right?
Yeah.
But yours is pretty darn interesting. What is the lesson, though, given that not all of us have 4-star general ancestors? What is the lesson that we can all take away about how we can begin to uncover and why we should uncover at least some, maybe not all, every detail, but at least some of our family history?
I think the takeaway here for everyone listening is one of the biggest learnings I had in this whole process, and that was, if you don't write your own family history, you personally, you, the listener, you, Evan, everyone who's tuned in, if you don't write it because they're public servants, because they work for public office, they're part of the public domain, and the families don't own the stories, the journalist who writes about it, or the photographer that photographs it, or the videographer that films it, they own it. Whoever captures the story owns the story because they're in the public domain. So it's important for me to tell you and everyone, at a bare minimum, if this story of a 4-star general can stay hidden in our own family, who knows the stories that are out there? Who knows how good those stories are that are on your couch, that are at your grandparents' house, that are at your auntie's house? We are only looking forward. Everyone I know is like, my kids are doing this, I'm doing this. My kids are doing this, I want my kids to have this. But very few people, if any, that I know go, I want to know what my parents are doing, my grandparents did, why they did this, why they set this up for me, what they wanted from me. Maybe the inspiration and your purpose is actually going to come from the past, not the future. And for me, I wouldn't have normally guessed that would have been that direction. But, once you scratch the surface, you just don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah, you were trapped. You couldn't get out anymore. If we want to learn about the Tuskegee Airmen, just quickly, what is the most important exhibit we can go? How can we, aside from reading your book, how can we find out about them in a really, in a fulfilling way?
I think the best way, well, obviously their website, TuskegeeAirmen.org, to really get more of a historical play-by-play stats and facts version. I think going to Tuskegee, Alabama, and actually seeing Moulton Field, where they flew, where they lived, some are recreated, some are still there. I think seeing it in Tuskegee, Alabama, the Tuskegee Airmen are on the back of a quarter, the Alabama quarter, as part of that state by state series that the U.S. Mint put out. The Tuskegee Airmen flipped a coin at a few Super Bowls ago. I mean, the Tuskegee Airmen are visible, so you get bits and pieces of them. The San Diego Air and Space Museum just opened up a robot animatronic of Ben Davis Jr. discussing the Tuskegee Airmen, and they just opened up a new P-51 airplane exhibit. The African American Museum of History in the Smithsonian in DC, they have a full model of an authentic Tuskegee Airman plane. So there's a lot of different places geographically where you can see and learn about the Tuskegee Airmen. But I think it's hard to say where there's a center unless you really went to the website to read all the stats and facts.
So I'm really curious, what does it mean to be a corporate diversity officer, and how does, you did writing this book and learning about this experience further inform your career?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, Evan, that I did when I started going on the journey is that I became a corporate diversity officer, because when I read the story of Ben and I read the story of how they were treated as if they were invisible, I wanted to ensure that in my world that I knew, which was corporations, that I would ensure that those that were invisible would be visible. And I switched my career to become a diversity officer to do just that. I didn't want to sit around and say, these men fought for me to be visible and have options, but then look at environments and corporations that were not visibly showing any diversity or efforts in that manner. And in 2012, I started my career as a diversity officer to ensure that that was exactly what I was going to do. Continue the legacy in the private sector as they did in the public.
What challenges are there still in the corporate world in making sure things are diverse?
I think in the corporate world, I think the biggest challenge is the word diversity has become so broad. People are having multiple conversations about different things at the same time. So if you talk about the United States, diversity is about race. But if you go to, UK, diversity is more about class. If you go to China, diversity is more about gender balance. If you go to the Middle East, diversity is more about Saudiization and Emiratiization, which is the local ethnicities getting fair options and chances for jobs over expats. So over the last few years, I have traveled around the world to understand what is diversity globally. So I think the first challenge is, what are we saying is defining diversity? And is it becoming so broad that it's actually becoming harder to make evolutions and changes in corporate environments? So I think what Ben Jr. did, and if you look at what the Tuskegee Airmen did, it was actually one thing at a time. If you remember in the 60s, it was the Black movement, the woman movement, the gay movement. They were all separate, but they were defined and people knew the beginning, middle, and end. When you start discussing and addressing diversity, we have to be more specific when we speak about it to understand what areas we should focus on. So that's one of the biggest overall corporate, challenges in today's business environment. But importantly is the leadership that Ben taught me. And the number one thing that he taught me was it's important that you use the system to diffuse the system. You must use the system. You must be a part of it. You must have a voice. Your voice will then become a vote. Your vote will then become policy, and you must wait because evolution takes time. And in time, you can accomplish the impossible, but the impossible does take time. And he would say that to me all the time. And when I hear that, I think I'll start today where I am. I'll keep his legacy going, but I will also do what I can to help where I can in corporate environments.
What's next, dare I ask? Do you think you'll take on another project, a book project or a documentary project?
I don't know. The publisher asked me what I wanted to write about next. But I think
you're like, oh, sorry, it broke up there on the line there for a minute.
For me, it would just be to, they just opened the Benjamin O. Davis Senior Veterans Village in Detroit. I think I would like to do more with veterans. I think I would like to maybe be a voice for the veterans because a lot of veterans need a voice.
Man, I'll tell you, I wish I was just in. I was just in Detroit. I wish I had known. I would have gone. To pay my respects there.
Yeah, they just did the ribbon cutting on Thursday, and they broke the ground with the shovels and everything.
So there would have been nothing there anyway. Okay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful square of dirt, but it's ready to be dug.
Literally dug, but Doug,
yeah.
You're Doug. Doug Melville, the author of Invisible Generals, Rediscovering Family Legacy, and a quest to honor America's first Black generals. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Check out the book. Check out his website, dougmelville.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter @Doug Melville. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.